I think right now we're in such a predatory society that corruption has become more the norm than something that we are surprised about.
We don't need to agree upon any other issue, but at least we should all understand that the government should belong to the people and not to the corporations and the special interests.
Who made these laws? Who decided that this is the law? Is it actually in our best interest, or do we in fact have to take action in a non-violent, civil, disobedient way?
What is the system that we want to live in and that we can have trust in? Because I think the other issue is like there's no trust in this current political system. And it's hard to have trust in something when you're constantly seeing your rights being taken away.
Not to submit to the oppression and fear of them as being too strong and we are too weak. No, it should not be that way.
The issues are quite simple. We do understand what corruption is. We don't want it. We want this sort of transparency in our system.
Hello and good evening. Welcome to the Disrupt Film Series. I'm Veronica Medina, Director of the Disrupt Program and a trustee with the Museum of Political Corruption. Thank you for joining us tonight for an in-depth conversation about the documentary, The Hottest August. Since 2022, this film series has featured several award-winning films and urgent conversations that help us understand the broader implications of corruption, particularly how it affects our everyday lives. Tonight, we delve into the themes of climate change, social justice, and political corruption, all interwoven in Brett Story's compelling film. Since The Hottest August was originally released in 2019, we've seen significant shifts in public awareness and policy. Awareness of climate change has heightened due to increased extreme weather events, but this has also led to greater polarization along partisan lines. Discussions around political corruptions have become more visible, particularly around issues like ethics and transparency in government, and movements like Black Lives Matter have pushed conversations on social justice and systemic inequality into the mainstream. Given this context, we are eager to revisit the film's themes and explore what has changed and what hasn't in the years since. But before we move on to this vital conversation, I would like to make a plea. If you have participated in our events before, you already know that the Disrupt Film Series, like many other initiatives at the Museum of Political Corruption, is offered as a free public program. To ensure we can continue to bring you these important films and discussions, we are currently running a crowdfunding campaign. The QR code you see on your screen right now will take you directly to our GoFundMe page, and we've also added a direct link to the campaign on our comment section below. If you value the Disrupt Film Series and its mission, please consider making a contribution today. Your donation, big or small, can help us continue to bring you this important program free of charge. We appreciate your support. Now, without further ado, I invite you all to take a quick look back at The Hottest August.
From all the hills came screams. A piece of sky beside the crescent sun was detaching. It was the monstrous swift shadow cone of the moon, hauling darkness like plague behind it.
Do you have any worries about the future?
What future?
I'm greatly concerned about the planet, which is falling apart.
Even before tragedy happened in my own life, I had made that choice to just be ready and prepared for things.
I grew up here, my mother grew up here. Nothing ever happened like this.
It's a shame. It's a shame.
No. No.
This is a modern time filled with a lot of stress.
People have thought the United States is far more stable than it actually is. We've had this uneasy truth, this fake stability for a long period of time.
I believe your quality of life is better if you have a lot of money.
We're very resourceful. I'll worry about it when the time comes.
Hands up! Don't shoot! Hands up! Don't shoot! Hands up! Don't shoot! Hands up! Don't shoot! Hands up! Don't shoot!
I'm honored to introduce our distinguished guests for tonight's discussion. First, I welcome filmmaker and Hottest August director Brett Story. She's an award-winning filmmaker whose work pushes the boundaries of political cinema. Brett's films have screened at major international film festivals, including Sundance, New York Film Festival, and IDFA. She is the author of Prison Land, Mapping Carceral Power Across Neoliberal America. Also joining us is Naomi Oreskes. She is the Henry Charles Lee Professor of the History of Science at Harvard University and has co-authored the landmark exposé Merchants of Doubt. She is a leading voice on climate change and one of the main forces shaping scientific knowledge today. And finally, we have Marie Cohen, Professor of Sustainability Studies and co-founder of the Future Earth Knowledge Action Network. He's expert on sustainable consumption and production, and the author of The Future of Consumer Society. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for being with us tonight. Brett, I would like to start with you, but I think I think Marie will come back soon. But Brett, let me start with you, and I really love how you connect these big issues like climate change and social equity to things that are so mundane. And, it's this kind of filmmaking that really portrays ordinary people living ordinary lives, but with the narration and the music, it almost takes it to a kind of a surreal atmosphere. But at the same time, it's still a chronicle of everyday life and just offered through a very unique perspective. And so I would love to hear about your process of developing the film's narrative, why you decided to make it in this particular style, and why did you decide to make this film, and what was it that you tried to accomplish when you set out to make it?
Yeah, thank you so much, Veronica, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited about this incredible panel you put together. So the origin of this film comes from a sort of few different beginnings, and one, this is going to sound really basic, but one of the sort of impetuses for this film was my own self-reflection on why I, as a political person, as an activist, as a geographer by professional training, and as someone who cares deeply about the fate of the planet, why I don't like climate change films or tend not to watch them, tend not to be very moved or inspired by them. And in fact, worse than that, wondering, sort of what the problem is with, cinematic attempts to deal with or investigate the climate crisis, sort of feeling like cinema and the film is inadequate to the challenge. And I think in trying to answer that question, I think that one of the answers I came up with, which I didn't necessarily know was right, but was at least motivating me to try my own attempt, was that this sort of feeling that so many climate change films are responding to this idea that the problem of climate passivity among a population has to do with a sort of state of unknowing, that people don't know that the climate crisis is real, is upon us, is an emergency. And that might have been true 20 years ago, but I just don't think that that's the case now. And I think that, continued efforts to use cinema, which has this very particular power that's different than scholarship or different than journalism or different than an activist campaign, to just convince people that climate change is real, was sort of a fool's errand. Most people who are watching those films already know that it's real and already are pretty terrified about it. And in fact, there's a way in which sometimes cinema that just seeks to terrorize us can have the opposite effect of trying to make us active. It can make us more passive because we become completely paralyzed in our own kind of terror and feeling of powerlessness. So I was interested in making a climate change film that's really, sort of turns the question on its head and instead asks a question about the human species, why it is that we cannot seem to respond to it. And I feel like that's a worthwhile question of any urgent political, issue, but especially something that is existential. If our very capacity to survive is at stake, then why can't we seem to do anything about it? And so the film became, the idea for the film was to make a kind of chronicle of human beings at this moment, almost a kind of anthropological look at one city over the course of 1 month, with a kind of uneasy perspective. Like in the film, you don't really know who the viewer, the seer is. You hear this voice. Maybe that's a voice from myself as a filmmaker from the future. So maybe the gaze is from a future population that's looking back at our time and asking us, what were you doing? Why didn't you see the calamity coming? Why weren't you doing anything about it? But it's a little bit more playful than that. The gaze might be the other animals that we share a planet with, so the film has lots and lots of sort of moments of looking at animals and thinking about how they're looking at us. Or maybe it's a kind of like even more science fiction than that. Maybe it's just the sort of like a gaze from an outside the human species in some way. But the point was to try and make an archival film that does not wait for the future to arrive and for answers to be gleaned in hindsight, but produces a kind of archive of the present that's immediately offered to a public to as an opportunity for self-reflection. And as such, it's a portrait of society. That's the question isn't, is climate change is real? The question is, how are we as human beings dealing with that knowledge as conscious or as subconscious as it is? And I think for many people, it's subconscious. It's part of the ambience of our era to know that the planet is in crisis. And so what is, if the sort of experiment of the film is to say, what happens if you walk around New York for 1 month and just ask people how they're doing, ask people what they're thinking about, try and figure out how they're translating their own anxiety, maybe without even knowing it. Is a film, made out of these sort of banal detours actually maybe more useful in answering some fundamental questions about human response to climate change than perhaps a film that's full of statistics and data?
Yeah, absolutely. There's way more answers in the way people talk or what they don't talk about than, in many other ways of just showing information. And Naomi and Maury, how did the film resonate with you? And especially not just personally, but also coming from your professional fields?
Well, I could jump in. I'm so glad we're having this conversation. And Brett, I'm so happy being here with you today because I 100% agree with everything you just said. And one of the things that's been challenging for me, because I live most of my life with scientists, is how problematic that scientific framing is. And like you, I'm, frustrated, disappointed, bored by most climate documentaries because they focus on the science. But we already know the science, and we've known the science for a really long time. And climate change did begin as a scientific story 75 years ago, when scientists first recognized that burning fossil fuels would put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which would heat the planet, and all kinds of other stuff would happen. So it does begin as a scientific story, but it's not a scientific story anymore and hasn't been for a long time. And so it's really gratifying for me to see political filmmakers like you look at this question, which really has to be analyzed as a political problem. And I especially appreciate that we're doing this event with the Museum of Political Corruption, because in many ways, climate change is a story of corruption. It's a story of how the fossil fuel industry has corrupted our governments, that they continue to subsidize fossil fuels even while they're wrecking our climate system and hurting people and damaging property. It's a story about how the fossil fuel industry has corrupted our economy to make us so dependent upon fossil fuels, even though other sources of energy are cheaper and cleaner and better. And it's a story about the corruption of culture. And if I can make a shameless plug for my latest book, The Big Myth, How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market. We need government to represent us, but we have been subjected to a massive propaganda campaign, heavily funded by the fossil fuel industry, but also other industries as well, to persuade us to not trust our own government, to not believe in the power of governance, to not believe in our power as individuals to work through our governmental structures, and to somehow think that the market, the free market, will somehow solve these problems on its own. And of course, that's not true. First of all, because there's no such thing as the free market. And to the extent that we have markets, they have proved themselves unable to solve this problem in any meaningful way. So happy to be part of this conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you. Marie?
Yeah, well, thanks. And as an initial disclaimer, let me just say that I'm not a film critic, but I really appreciated Brett's introduction, and it was sort of empowering because it communicated to me that I got what she was trying to do, in watching the film, the expression, the metaphor that kept kind of coming back to me is that these are people who are sort of strangers in their own land. They're New Yorkers, but they sort of have this sort of atomized existence and this palpable sense of uncertainty. Uncertainty about the future, or uncertainty about their own prospects, and this is inherently, at least to my mind, a powerful sociological and indeed anthropological critique, and that ordinary people are not taxonomists in the same way that scientists are. That scientists are trained to put specific problems in particular boxes and to put labels on those boxes, and that certain issues are problems for the chemists and certain problems are problems for the financial analysts and so forth. But, ordinary people don't think that way. Ordinary people are just trying to cope and trying to survive. And, a term of reference that's gotten a fair amount of play over the last couple of years is the idea of a polycrisis. That it's the climate, it's the financial system, it's the political system, it's epidemics, it's COVID, it's lack of trust in people, lack of trust that people have in their neighbors, the instability that exists in the workplace. All of this stuff, combines in people's minds and experiences in kind of a complicated way. And, I don't think we do justice when we try to pull individual problems out and sort of approach it in a rational scientific discourse. And I think that was powerful about the movie, is that let people speak in their own voices. And, and these are people, these are our neighbors, these are our friends, these are our relatives. And, these are the people that we gather around the table at Thanksgiving with. They don't read academic journals, and they're not, glued to the next news update from CNN or, the next article to appear in the New York Times. They're just trying to live their lives and in a moment of fraught uncertainty and transition.
Yes, absolutely. And, the interesting thing, and I think echoing a little bit some of what you said, is that the film was shot in 2017 during the first Trump administration, right? I mean, so much has happened. And even during his first administration, he managed to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Agreement. He weakened a bunch of environmental regulations and all the fossil fuels promotion. and then the Biden administration tried to, revert some of the damage. And so I actually wanted to ask, both of you in each of your fields, how, have what do you believe are the most consequential changes in the environmental policies over these years, and how does the second Trump term differ from his first administration, especially considering, the budget cuts, the completely lack of respect of the research and scientific research. Since taking office, he's doing everything he can, even more forcefully than the first time. So I wanted to hear from you what you think some of the differences are, and what are the biggest consequential implications of those things. I don't know, Naomi, if you'd like to start.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I was like, which you? Well, it's like, where do you begin? There's so much going on right now that's so disruptive and terrible. I guess the two things that I worry about the most is, one is the public lands, the attempt to have a massive sell-off of public lands. And this is something Republicans have been talking about for a long time, because fundamentally they don't believe in the common good. They don't believe in public lands. They don't believe in public anything. So I think that one of the mistakes that a lot of people on the left have made is not stressing enough how much this really is a question of public goods, and that we are all in this together. Some of us, of course, are suffering more than others, but ultimately climate change affects everyone, rich, poor, black, white. There isn't really any escaping from climate change, even though rich people will obviously have more to buffer them. And so I think the conversation about commonality, and even though in a way, I agree with Maury, in a way, climate change atomizes us and political polarization atomizes us, but it also reminds us when we have an event like Superstorm Sandy, or the recent hurricanes Milton and Helene, the fires in Pacific Palisades. First of all, Pacific Palisades was proof that rich people don't get off scot-free, right? And if they think that somehow they will, they're wrong about that. But it's also a reminder that all communities can be affected. And when floods hit communities, these are things that affect people very, very broadly. So we are in this together, even if we don't act like it. And so thinking about the commonalities and the interconnections, I think, are super important. And public lands are also a place where many people of different walks of life come together. Hikers, hunters, fishermen, skiers, snowboarders, ordinary people, wealthy people use public lands. And so I think that, and if the public lands are sold off, that will be irreversible. And so I tend to focus my attention on things that are irreversible, for the obvious reason that they can't be undone. So I really think all of us need to be talking as much as possible about, it's a kind of kleptocracy. They're going to sell these things off to the highest bidder, which will often be their cronies and corrupt corporations. And it is not in the interest of the American people to see this kind of corporate giveaway of public lands. The other thing, of course, that affects, that I think about all the time, is science. And we're seeing this massive assault on science across the board, and not just particular agencies associated with environmental regulation like the EPA, which again, we've seen the Republicans have hated the EPA since it was created. They've been trying to undermine it for decades. But what's happening now that's worse and different is this wholesale attempt to eliminate science in all kinds of agencies, including things like the National Weather Service, the U.S. Geological Survey, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. And if you ask yourself the question, well, why? Why would they attack science broadly, even things like biomedical science that keep us safe and healthy? The answer is they hate science because science underlies regulation. It's science that tells us how all these corporate activities, dangerous chemicals, fossil fuels, pesticides, hurt people. And so science shows that their policies are corrupt and damaging. Science shows that we need to regulate dangerous pesticides, fossil fuels. Science shows we need vaccines to keep us safe and healthy. And so in so many different ways, corporate America has come to view science as the enemy. and has worked to undermine public trust in science, not just in specific areas like climate science, but actually across the board. And we see that in public polling opinion now that shows that trust in science has become very polarized in a way that it didn't used to be. Democrats now trust science and Republicans don't. That wasn't true 20 or 30 years ago. In fact, if anything, if we go back 40 or 50 years to the 1970s and 80s, it used to be that Republicans trusted science more and Democrats were more skeptical. And now it's completely reversed. And this is absolutely related to the Republican attempt to roll back the regulations that protect people, consumers, and the natural environment.
Yeah, I mean, not to sound like a historian, but to pick up on Naomi's point is that, you know, a lot of this goes back to the 1960s and 1970s, that the successes of the environmental movement, you know, particularly in terms of the ultimate passage of some of the keystone environmental legislation that still guides public policy today. Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, et cetera, you know, owed their success both to science and to popular mobilization. And and Naomi certainly knows this, is that the lesson that was learned from that experience was never again. That, you know, corporate oligarchs and you know, the irony is that a lot of this legislation was passed under the pen of a Republican president named Richard Nixon, and that's, you know, one of these, you know, paradox of the last 40 or 50 years of American environmentalism, and there are, you know, it's a longer story and reasons for why that came to be. But the lesson of that era was exactly as Naomi explained.
Yeah, and if I could just, sorry, Naomi.
Just jump in one more thing on that point, because it's such an important point. So thank you, Maury, for underscoring it. I keep hearing, you know, scientists pointing out that it was Richard Nixon who, you know, created the EPA, as if he was somehow some kind of great environmentalist, but that was not the case at all. He hated environmentalists. He had no interest in the environment, but there was such a groundswell of public support for environmental protection in the late 60s and early 70s that he recognized that he would be politically vulnerable if he didn't do something in that domain. And so this really proves the importance of public action, that when people turned out to protest and mobilize over rivers catching fire and polluted air and water, even a Republican president paid attention. And so that's what we need to do again, is to have that groundswell of public action.
Yeah, and all I was going to say, just jumping in and on the theme of politicians, I mean, as I was, you know, going around to all the boroughs of New York, trying to really deeply listen to people and take people seriously as both experts over their own lives, but also unreliable narrators, insofar as we're all tasked with the impossibility of making sense of big systems, but through the vocabularies that are made available to us, sometimes, you know, sometimes through the sort of worst, you know, forms of discourse and weaponization of language. As I was doing that, I felt like, you know, the really big takeaway for me was a kind of realization that I was hearing an echo of something that former Prime Minister of Britain, Margaret Thatcher, would say and said early on in her leadership, which was she's famous for saying, as she was dismantling unions, as she was dismantling public goods, she would say, "There's no such thing as society. There's only individuals and their families." And I would talk to people, and, you know, she did this as part of a project that we now have a language for. We call it neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a set of, you know, policies and economic transformations that are about privatization in every realm, the marketization of every realm, but it also has a logic and a discourse to it, which is, you know, the idea that there is no such thing as a public sphere, you know, common space, anything outside of individual competition And that competition at this moment is for resources that people are told and deeply feel are scarce and getting scarcer. So I would talk to people for this film, and they would acknowledge some of their anxieties. Will Social Security still exist when I'm older? I mean, very valid fear. You know, will I be able to stay in my apartment next month? The rents are too high. Valid fear. And so almost in the next breath, they would express a sort of a form of optimism, but that optimism was almost always in sort of neoliberal terms. I will get lucky. I will figure something out. I will take responsibility for my actions. And I feel like the toxicity of the neoliberal discourse over this period of many decades, you know, at the same time as there's an actual dismantling of all kinds of public protections, privatization of public lands, has also been to empty our sensibility of an idea that we belong to a public at all, that our fates are intertwined with each other. And I think that is really, you know, that's part of how the human experience at this moment and the discourse, the question of the language we're using to understand our predicament is deeply intertwined with the sort of policy, you know, transformations that we're continuing to see unfold at this moment, and that appear as common sense. You know, the reason that the government can dismantle public lands is because the idea of public or common sphere has been so devalued for decades.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's such an important point because this didn't happen by accident, right? People like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and the businesses that supported them, this was part of the program to make us disbelieve in the common good, to disbelieve in the whole notion of public goods. And it's so ironic because, you know, it doesn't come out of the roots of capitalism. And if you read Adam Smith, he talks at great length about the importance of taxation to support public goods. So it's really a kind of misrepresentation of traditional liberalism. And the other thing that Margaret Thatcher said that was equally bad as the infamous "No Society" line is when she said there's no alternative. I feel like that is so at the heart of this whole story because, you know, the other side has been so powerful and so effective in presenting this narrative of, you know, trusting the marketplace or trusting business to solve our problems, or believing that privatization is the only solution and individual action, that we've lost sight of what the alternatives actually look like. And of course, there are alternatives. There are always alternatives, but the narrative is really intended to shut down our capacity to imagine those alternatives.
Oh, yes, you guys said so much that I'd love to unpack. I don't know if we have enough time, but it made me think of, just going back to the film, just me think of one of the most impactful moments for me, Brett, was that scene of the group dynamic. And there was like a young woman, like a young mother, and she is, you know, talking about witnessing this anti-immigrant rant, and I think she was referring to the 2016 election, and that the fact that she felt really unable to speak up to help this woman, this immigrant woman. And, you know, you could tell that she was very uncomfortable, that she felt terrible about it. And, you know, it stood out to me because it's such a short scene. It's a very, you know, short segment, but it says so much about our sense of powerlessness, you know, in face of these things that seem to be so big, so much beyond our understanding or our capacity to do something about it, you know. And I think we are constantly being bombarded with so much information, so much of it it's not even true, so much of it is not relevant, that it's easy to feel misguided, it's easy to feel lost, or, you know, the sense of fear that things can happen but we cannot do anything about it. So, you know, I just kind of wanted to bring that because also 2017, when we think about it, it's feels like a completely different world before COVID, before George Floyd, before the attack in U.S. Capitol. You know, so many impactful and you know, just moments in history that really kind of changed a lot of our perception. And so I really wanted to hear from you you know, what are some of these strategies not just for climate change, but our understanding or making sense of the universe, or making sense of these big systems. How have these strategies of, undermining scientific findings, undermining even the anti-vax movement and the denial of so many things, how have the statics of making people unbelieve everything that they were meant to believe, and even the fact that they don't stand up for when they see some wrongdoings? So how has that evolved over time, especially considering where we are now in comparison to 2017? It's I know it's a big question, but you've been really taking the conversation much further, and I wanted to kind of see how have we gotten to this point where we are now.
Well, maybe I can just go first, because I just also want to point out about that scene. You hear this story about this woman who's, saw someone attack someone nearby, and then she just, felt too afraid to intervene, and she's been thinking about it and feeling guilty ever since. That takes place at a gathering called a bystander training. So in the trailer, when you see people say, no, 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 this is a group of people. These were happening all over New York in 2017, where they were, small community gatherings of people who were training each other how to intervene in precisely these kinds of attacks. And I think that, that is a way to acknowledge that, yes, I battle it too. An overwhelming despair about the inhumanity of people, how awful people can be, how awful our leadership is, how overpowered we are by a militarized, death-driven set of governments all over the world. It seems to be getting worse. And yet, also, it's a really important to remind ourselves that it doesn't take much for people to feel like, in fact, there are alternatives and there is something we can do. And I think the beautiful election turnout that we just saw in New York around the mayoral primaries is a great example of that. I mean, just record turnout, thousands upon thousands of volunteers, and really practical solutions that immediately, were understood by the voters. What would make your life better? That's the question Zoran Mondani asked people and then answered in his policies. And I think that that's something that's actually a really important reminder to people that we can, as much as we are being encouraged to not just encouraged to be, to entire understandings of the world from reality, but there are these systematic attacks on all sort of institutions of knowledge. So the science community, but also the humanities community. I mean, it's a playbook of every fascist government to go after the so-called elites in the form of higher education. And that's because an educated population is bad for right-wing governments. But actually, all it really takes is to see an alternative in action, to remember that it is possible and it's what we want. And so I think that can really re-empower us, because we can do that at manageable scale and then build up. But I'd love to hear what that means in terms of actual climate policy as well.
So listening to Brett, it sort of takes me back some years. I sort of started my academic career studying disasters, which I know sounds rather peculiar to somebody who may encounter that for the first time. But there actually is a sub-discipline within sociology focused on the sociology of disasters. And there are folks who sort of wait to some degree with bated anticipation for the next hurricane in order to get out into the field. And within the sociology of disasters, there's a well-established conception of a therapeutic community. And we've all seen this in the aftermath of major disasters. You have media talking about looting and decay of society and all this other stuff going on, but actually what's occurring is neighbors getting together and helping one another and binding together and helping to rebuild. And after a couple of days, if you follow the news on one of these kinds of events, there's the storyline changes from damage assessment to what can we do to make ourselves bigger and faster and stronger and so forth. I think that there's some useful analogy in that. Unfortunately, I think it's going to take a catastrophe of some major significance, not just a localized or a regionalized hurricane or earthquake, but something of a sort of broad national scope. One would like to hope it won't be a war, but it's easy if you let your mind to start to race to kind of get into that direction. I sort of began the second Trump administration with the realization that, first of all, personally, I wasn't going to allow myself to sort of be glued to the television set and to the newspaper on a daily basis. That I did that the first time, and I think many other people have done it. Did that the first time, and we're sort of in a moment now where what do people do when they kind of want to tune out? Is they sort of focus their time and attention on personal improvement. And whether it's yoga or going to the gym or painting or knitting or something, they, kind of retreat into their own small world. But I think that we're kind of beginning to come out of that phase. The large demonstrations, parades that occurred 2 weeks ago, I think was a manifestation of that. But, I think, ultimately the catalyst is going to have to be a tragedy, unfortunately, of some significant magnitude.
Naomi would like to add it to that.
Yeah, well, that's a lot to chew on. And I guess I feel a little bit differently than what Maury just said, only because I used to think that, but then we had some disasters that were on the scale that I would have thought would have changed the situation. I'm thinking especially of Hurricane Katrina, which was a kind of national scale disaster in the sense that it was massively covered in the news media, huge numbers of people displaced. We had our first climate refugees in America after Hurricane Katrina, people who left Louisiana, never went back. And yet it didn't move the needle. In fact, it led to a whole new round of climate denial, of people denying that hurricanes were related to climate change. So I don't doubt that we could be heading towards some kind of national catastrophe, but I guess what I'd rather say is that I think that, and I know you're not advocating waiting for the catastrophe, but I guess I want to say I feel like the catastrophes are already here, and that should be part of the narrative to make the point. All these things that scientists predicted 50 years ago that they thought would be catastrophes have happened, but we haven't acted on them because of all these other issues about disempowerment, deliberate dissuasion, confusion, all of that. The other thing I wanted to say, because Veronica, you mentioned science, and not to make this about science, because I just started by saying fundamentally this is no longer about science, but there is a component about it that's definitely about information and knowledge. Actually, two components. One is what Brett already said. So to underscore her point, all authoritarian and fascistic governments attack knowledge and knowledge elites. And that's George Orwell's whole story, right? And we all read Animal Farm or 1984 in high school, but yet somehow we read it, but we forgot it, or we didn't understand it, or I don't know what. So it shouldn't at all surprise us that the current administration is attacking, and this, as Brett said, not just scientific knowledge, but humanistic knowledge, social and natural sciences, medicine, the whole 9 yards. But also the other piece that I think is really important to talk about is the piece that connects to capitalism. So if you think about the long history of capitalism, not just the last 50 years of neoliberalism, but the whole history, there's two things that we've learned unequivocally. And that's that capitalism is very powerful in lots of ways, and it has absolutely generated wealth and prosperity in many parts of the world, but it has two giant proven Achilles heels, so one for each foot. One is inequality, which Thomas Piketty has written about so powerfully. The other, though, is what the economists call external costs. And again, this is something we've known about for a long time. When you do stuff, whether you have a factory, you fly in an airplane, you turn on a light, whatever it is, there are external costs. That is to say, the costs of those activities, the true costs that are not reflected in the price you pay for the gallon of gas or the kilowatt hour of electricity or whatever it is, the price of that shampoo that has endocrine disrupting chemicals in it. Those costs are borne by ordinary citizens all over the planet. So the corporations that sell these products or undertake these activities make huge profits, trillions of dollars for the fossil fuel industry, but we pay those costs. And this giant problem. It's a giant flaw. It's an inequality. It's an injustice, whatever word you want to describe it. And how do we know about those external costs? Who documents them? Well, mostly scientists and other academics, right? I mean, it's a lot of the data information about inequality is also documented by scientists and academics. So undermining science, undermining knowledge is a way of denying the true cost of capitalism. And if people really understood the connections between, putting that gallon of gas in your car and all the costs that are accruing to all of us, I think that it would be a game changer. So it's not to say that it's a problem of understanding exactly, but it is to say that there's a kind of disconnect that people, as Maury just said, I think Brett said as well, people are just trying to live their lives. They're just going about their business. And there's nothing wrong with that. We all do it. But at the same time, when we put that gallon of gas in our car or turn on our lights, we're not really thinking about or connecting it to those costs. And of course, the media are complicit in this too. So, I mean, how many of you noticed these last few days? We had, record-breaking, scorching heat across the Northeast United States, records broken all over the place. And the news media was filled with discussions about how the cause of the heat wave was warm water in the Gulf of Mexico or some heat dome thing. No, we all learned about proximal and distal causes when we were in high school. The true cause of these heat waves is climate change. And yet the media almost never says that because they've been pressured and intimidated. They've been made to feel that if they say that, they're editorializing or they're politicizing, as opposed to telling the scientific truth about what is driving this record heat that we've just experienced these last few days and have experienced repeatedly for decades now. And every time we have one of these events, there's someone out there saying, oh, no, you can't talk about climate change. And we fall for it over and over again.
Yeah, no, what is interesting also, and I think the film brings that nuance very brilliantly, is that climate change is not something that's completely isolated. It's completely connected to a number of other systemic issues, right? And I think what Brett wanted to make with her film and bring this idea of climate change within this greater spectrum, of considering also social injustice and economic inequality. And oftentimes especially in the neoliberal political environment that we are living, things become too compartmentalized, and we lose this the capacity to understand the interconnectedness of these issues. And so for us to tackle one issue, we will need to look into these other issues that are connected to it. So not necessarily a question that we might have an answer tonight, but how can we really move beyond the partisan lines and look at these as more of a holistically than just as political issues that are not necessarily connected to greater systemic problems?
Well, maybe I'll just talk as a someone who works in the realm of narrative and images a little bit, because I think that, one of the themes of the Hottest August is the theme of racism. One of the things that felt shocking then that I think would feel less shocking now for terrible reasons is what happened in Charlottesville when we saw open white supremacists march through a city, proudly. And I remember when that happened during the month of August, and everyone sort of was like, was so shocked that Trump at the time said, there are good people on both sides. Mm-hmm. But in many ways it had been, and of course this makes sense, this had been foreshadowed in the conversations I was already having with people that were coded so often with the kinds of and the forms of scapegoating that are already pervasive. And we tend to call those racism because it is racism, but to take seriously racism is to also understand that racism is not a natural phenomena, but is a social phenomena that's produced to serve a particular set of interests and to naturalize particular inequalities, to enshrine those inequalities and mystify those inequalities as somehow natural, inevitable, and just. And I think that is something that is really related to this question of the climate crisis, because so much of the way in which we're internalizing our own fears and trying to cope with our own fears as we recognize that these disasters are more and more are going to be more and more common, and that we don't have public infrastructure that's going to help keep us safe, is that it makes all of us even more, I would argue, vulnerable to, stories from our politicians about who is deserving and who is undeserving of the means of survival in that kind of catastrophic scenario, the kind of catastrophic scenarios that are already existing. And so I think that, like, really thinking hard about the indivisibility of the climate crisis, not just because environmental calamity is geographically uneven, is uneven across populations. The poor people of color tend to bear the brunt the worst, but as Naomi said, it's coming for all of us. But also because in a scenario where we think that there is no way out and we don't have a vocabulary to understand this sort of system, we're only offered a vocabulary that tells us things are someone's fault or our own fault, like we didn't recycle enough, or like this and this leader didn't do the right thing. That's not systemic thinking. And I think that in the absence of a narrative that helps people make sense of the world that they're in, then we're increasingly vulnerable to really dangerous and racialized forms of storytelling that tell that make us believe and then act on the beliefs that there are people that are deserving and some people that are undeserving, or there's some people at fault. Why is there such intense xenophobia around immigration? Why are we, a country like United States that's made up of people that came from elsewhere, unless they're indigenous people, in a hysteria over other people moving in order to find a better life? Well, that's a one way of reading that is a hysteria around feeling and coping with a sense that we're abandoned by our leaders, we're abandoned by there's no public infrastructure that is fulsome enough to take care of all of us, and therefore there's going to be people that survive and people that don't, and racism is one way to enshrine, a sense of who is deserving and who is undeserving. So I do think that this is, for me, as a storyteller, as a person who works in images, who tries to think about how something like a movie can and should coexist with important scientific data and literature and good journalism and good policy. These things, there's a kind of narrative ecosystem as well that requires all of these different component parts that support each other. This is something I think a lot about, like how to tell stories that refuse the idea of siloing these issues, and that try and offer at a human level, in a relatable way, systemic, a systemic picture of a world that makes sense and matches people's real experiences.
Do Maury or Naomi want to add anything to that?
There's a short thought. I mean, I was gratified to receive the invitation to participate in this session here tonight, because I think the real challenge is one of narrative and storytelling. As Naomi indicated, case of climate change, we've known the science for decades, and the challenge before us is to tell better, more compelling stories. And the current administration, like it or not, tells a good story, and the performative art is to keep people engaged from one day to the next. And so the story topic changes every 72 hours. Even today, I sort of rolled my eyes, and there was a press conference being scheduled for 8 o'clock in the morning. And I was thinking to myself, who holds a press conference at 8 o'clock in the morning? Well, that we live in a world now of a full day news cycle. And so you don't wait until the end of the day to try to get on the 5 o'clock news. You hold your press conference at 8 o'clock in the morning as a means of commanding attention. Unfortunately, we find ourselves at a moment where it's a bit easier to tell stories of division and contempt and maligning one another. It's a lot harder to tell a compelling story under the current climate that embraces solidarity and a sense of common purpose and the public good. That's for me the challenge. It's not about publishing another 3 or 4 papers in scientific journals. It's the work that Brett and other storytelling, filmmaking, arts-oriented colleagues are doing that I think is where I would put my money over the next short to medium period of time.
But it's tricky too, isn't it, though? Because I've noticed in the science community, there's been a lot of recognition in the last few years that scientists have to communicate more effectively, differently, better. And so now there have been all kinds of events about, how do we tell our story? And I feel like that's a little tricky because scientists start talking about telling stories, then it can sound like, oh, it's just another story, right? So I feel like the word story in different contexts can have different valences, but what I think is so important about filmmaking and the arts in general is the way in which film can cope with complexity, that you can juxtapose different people's experiences. And I think you do this quite brilliantly, Brett. And I think in a way, all good filmmakers do this, right? That if a scientist gets too bogged down in the details, if it starts feeling too complex, people zone out. But something about narrative, something about the stories of people's lives, the audience is able to hold on to a kind of level of complexity, maybe because it's a complexity that we understand, that we know that our own lives are multifaceted, and we know that the people we live with are multifaceted. We can have people in our lives we love who we desperately disagree with about certain things. And so I think film and literature and the arts in general have the capacity to embrace complexity in a way that people can understand and relate to, rather than just kind of get turned off by. So I think, I obviously, as a person who has a foot in both the science and the humanistic camps, I see them as complementary and both really important. But at this particular moment, when we have so much scientific information, the human stories, I think, are really, really crucial.
Mm-hmm. Guys, it have been really fascinating. I just would love to continue hearing all of your ideas. I just also want to open to the questions from the audience. There are a couple here that we've selected that I would love to get to you. Let me start with Marina's question. Given the global influence of the United States, how do you see America's responsibility or role when it comes to the impacts of climate change on other countries? Who would like to take that?
Well, I could jump in because this is something I get asked about a lot. So the obvious answer is, of course, the United States is responsible. I mean, we remain one of the world's largest emitters. We're one of the top historic emitters. And there's a lot of American obfuscation, like we blame China. And it is true on an annual basis. China as a country now produces more carbon pollution than the United States does, but China also has 4 times as many people. So person per capita, the United States is still a far worse polluter than China is. But here's the thing. I mean, yes, from an environmental justice standpoint, from an accountability standpoint, obviously the United States is incredibly responsible for impacts of climate change on people across the globe. But we also know that the United States is not taking responsibility and really has never taken responsibility, not under Democratic presidents, not under Republican presidents. And so I just came back from Europe. And one of the things that I've been saying to European colleagues and friends and activists is I think that Europeans have to stop waiting for America to lead on this issue. I don't think the United States is going to lead on this issue, certainly not for the next 3 years, but probably not for longer than that. But the rest of the world is powerful too, especially when countries join together. And I think that there's tremendous capacity across the globe to address this issue. There's tremendous will, but there has been a tendency, particularly in Europe, to wait for the United States to lead. And, we're coming up on COP30, just sit with that. We've had 30 attempts to solve this problem through the COP process. And we know that the two countries that have been most obstructive in this process, and anyone who's been involved in this will tell you, are Saudi Arabia and the United States. So knowing that that's the case, it really behooves other countries to think about how they can begin to act despite the obstruction from countries like Saudi Arabia and the United States.
Mm-hmm. Marie would like to add anything?
Well, it's I spend a lot of time in Europe, and to follow on with Naomi's comments, you come back from a trip to Europe, and it's you stepped into a time warp. It's 25 years, or it's really a case of Europe is from Venus and America is from Mars. There's a science, there's a politics of sustainability transitions, of energy transition. There you have countries of Europe sort of grappling with the challenges of eco-social policy as they try to reorient sort of post-World War II social welfarism under sort of a new set of challenges. This doesn't mean to suggest that, all is great and good in Europe. I mean, Europe is struggling under many of the same forces of darkness that we're facing. And every time there's a regional election in Germany, you kind of bite your fingernails wondering what the outcome is going to be. But there is a political infrastructure and a sense of commitment. But yeah, right, as Europeans often find themselves looking over their shoulders. I think that there is a requirement to kind of cut the cord, and somebody's going to have to lead into into whatever we want to call it, a post-neoliberal, post-consumer future. That kind of transition does not occur in a globally equal and diffuse way. There'll be winners and there'll be losers, and there's no reason to say that, the United States is not going to, struggle mightily to implement a renewable energy transition. I mean, you take a look at what's going on in a country like Norway that is almost completely electrified its automobile fleet, or what's going on in a country like Denmark. And I always remind my students that we should not, that yes, in these kind of global sustainability discussions, attention oftentimes, turns to our European friends and counterparts. But there's fascinating stuff going on in Latin America.
I was just going to ask, what do you see the role of new economies, that being Latin America or countries in Africa? How do you see the potential for new economies to take that leadership role?
Yeah, well, I mean, sort of three success stories of Africa, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Kenya, are struggling at the moment. But you look at, and again, I'm not an expert on Africa, but I have been trying to pay closer and closer attention to what's going on in Latin America. And I don't mean to make too much of these sort of global metrics about happiness and well-being and life satisfaction and so forth. But Latin American countries are standouts in terms of being able to provide for and create a sense of conviviality on significantly smaller per capita ecological footprints. And I think there's important lessons there that those stories need to be told more than they do. That Latin America is not and again, from the United States standpoint, the stories that we tend to hear are about political instability and corruption, but there's other things going on in Latin America that I think are of global significance.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're almost running out of time, and I wanted to share this question that's about the film as well. It's from Tiago, and he's asking, watching the film, what struck with me the most was the silence after people stated their hopes for the future, mostly confident that things would turn out fine and that the climate wouldn't affect them. Watching it 9 years later, it's like a silence. It's immediately filled with the noise of the future. While making the film, was that your intention?
Yeah, thank you for that. I wouldn't say that's so much my intention as it is something that is in the film. I mean, the way I make films that genuinely can, or at least try to make films that can last and that can change. I mean, they change already depending on who's watching it and what they're bringing. So they're deliberately, they have intention. They have my intention. My idea is what I learned along the way, but they're deliberately organized to be open, precisely so that someone can recognize their own experiences, memories, questions in it. And so that they, over time, the meanings might change because we're imposing meanings depending on where we're at when we're watching it. And so I think, what I take from your question is something that I hoped for in the film, which is that it might be a kind of, I would talk about it this is sort of a weird metaphor, but I talked about it as a soil sample, like the cinematic equivalent of a soil sample. And, what happens as an experiment? What happens if you talk to people and you ask them genuinely in an open-ended way, what are you worried about? How are you feeling about the question? What do we learn from those answers? And I think part of what we've learned is not just the content, the specific things people mentioned, but also the sort of, as exactly what you're saying, Diego, that there's a pause, there's the quietness, there's the mind battling against itself. There's the mind battling against it, what it knows and what it fears. And I think that that's something we all do. I think that I think I think it's very scary to not know what's going to happen and to not feel any control. And precisely because it's scary, we rush to fill in that gap. And sometimes we fill it in with something that we heard from Donald Trump, or something we heard on the news, or something we heard at the grocery store. And sometimes we fill it in with what our mom told us when we were growing up about how if we just eat our vegetables, it'll be all okay, And I think how to interpret that silence is something that's going to continue to change depending on what happens in the world and at what point someone is watching it. But I just really love that formulation, that the silence is immediately filled with the noise of the future. The film itself is inspired by a really beautiful film that I would recommend, made in 1962 by Chris Marker, the famous French essayist Chris Marker and Pierre Lhomme, set in Paris, set entirely in Paris over the course of 1 month. And it is also a film that just sort of meanders with ordinary residents of the city, asking them the price of potatoes and what makes them happy. And as the film goes on, you realize it's a film about colonialism, and it's about the French experience in Algeria, and the 7-year war against Algerian resistance. And that creeps up on you. And one of the things Chris Marker used to say about that film is that what did he say? It was a fish tank for the fishermen of the future to cast their nets into and see what comes out. And so that was my hope for this film as well.
Well, I wanted to take that perspective of futurism, and I want to take the question back to all of you. So what are your hopes for the future? Would you like to start, Brett?
Yeah, I mean, I'm deeply invested in the question of how we learn that the reality of our world is not inevitable, and that we belong to something called a shared reality, and that our fates are intertwined, and that the world is actionable. I made a film last year actually about the workers at the Amazon facility in
Which
Staten
we're
Island.
showing here next in
Oh,
September.
great. So, you know the story then. This is a group of ordinary workers unaffiliated with any big union that decide to try and unionize their workplace despite 20 years of Amazon proving around the world that it was unorganizable, and the Teamsters and other unions basically giving up on it. And this very small group of multiracial, multi-class group of people successfully forms the first unionized Amazon warehouse in the history of that company. And I think that we're told that we can't do anything about the world. The world as it is the only possibility, and it's just not true. And when fascists destroy our history departments, it's precisely because the lessons of our history tell us that, remind us that things are changeable, and that if we want change, it requires human action, and mostly change for the better is human action organized collectively. And so that's, I think, the most important thing is to not give in to despair, not give in to hopelessness, work together, organize across difference, and fight for the things we believe in, and then prove to ourselves as well as others that we can win.
Beautiful. Naomi would like to tell us your take on the future.
Well, I love what Brett just said. I don't think I have too much more to add except to reinforce it by saying, look, I'm not that young, and I've lived through a lot of changes in my own life, and many of these changes were for the better, right? Civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, even a better conversation about race in America, even if we haven't fixed the problem. I feel like the kind of depth of conversation that's taking place now and about US history is a step in the right direction. So we know change is possible. One of the things I like to teach my students in my courses is about the history of the sugar boycott in England at the end of the 18th century, when people began to understand how brutal slavery was, and to understand that the sweetness in their tea was paid for by the bitterness of slavery. People began to boycott sugar. And this is an amazing story about how individual people, motivated by information, but also by compassion, helped to eliminate the British role in the slave trade. And it's just one example. There are many like that, but it's just as what Brett said, history is powerful because it shows us, it doesn't just tell us, but it shows us that real change is possible, and that everyday actions, everyday people, when they work together, empowered by an idea, can make real change. And so, for me personally, I plan to keep writing books because that's what I seem to know how to do best. And part of the point of the books, like movies or whatever, it's a way of giving people a structure to think about the problem and to think about the solutions.
Wonderful. Marie?
Yeah, I don't know what else to add. I mean, those were two great testimonials. I've spent the last 30 years studying consumerism and systems of consumption, and the way in which, particularly folks in what euphemistically gets referred to as the global North, but increasingly in the global South as well, sort of subscribe to lifestyle ambitions that are predicated on accumulation and affluence and status acquisition, and that I think many people, if they really had to look the issues in a forthright way, it's that we've been sort of sold a bill of goods into thinking that, the more stuff we have and the more stuff that we accumulate, the happier and more wonderful the world will be. But and I guess this comes back to some of the things that Brett was saying, is that we really lack a language for articulating ideas of sufficiency and enoughness. I mean, the fact that we even have to kind of rely on this kind of artificially created word of enoughness to communicate the point, that, you know, for many people, sufficiency speaks to a kind of deprivation and poverty and loss of opportunity. But I think the challenge of the next decades are, you know, how do we create lives that are less reliant on global supplies of energy and materials and continuous resource exploitation in far corners of the world, you know, without kind of falling back on a kind of nostalgic notion of localism and autarky, which unfortunately informs a lot of the contemporary environmental debate. But going forward, we're going to sort of need to learn how to keep, you know, competing ideas in our heads at the same time.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I guess it shows, you know, very clearly that the issues that the film raises, the Hottest August raises, remain as relevant and urgent as ever. And so, you know, I just want to thank you all for sharing all your invaluable insights and contributions in this wonderful discussion. You know, just want to thank you all for, you know, your efforts towards a more equitable and sustainable future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And congratulations, Brett, again on the film.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. And it's been a fabulous conversation. I really appreciate it.
Well, addressing climate change, social injustice, and political corruption requires collective action, ethical leadership, and a commitment to transparency and accountability. So with that, I want to thank everybody tonight for joining us for this Disrupt Film Series event. We hope we will continue to engage with the museum's initiatives and find ways to make a difference in your own communities. And one last announcement before we go. The Disrupt Film Series will take a short break now in July and August, but we'll be back around Labor Day in September with another live conversation featuring the acclaimed documentary Union, also by Brett Story and Stephen Mang. We're going to take a quick sneak peek at the film right now.
I happen to be a current Amazon worker at JFK8. The pay and the work conditions are totally a nightmare. They expect you to do 200, then after that they want you to do another 3, and then they want you to do another 4. They think that we're fucking robots.
Starting today, 8,000 Amazon warehouse workers on Staten Island will begin voting on whether they want to form a union.
You sign up, man, get a free plate, contribute to our movement. We can all help.
When's your next class?
Mine is now.
So you need to put the game down and find out how to get in there.
We got to continue to fight because this company has not been held accountable.
Is Chris Smalls. He was fired when he went outside and protested.
You make Amazon $638 million a day. It's time we get paid our fair share. Cancel all your plans unless it's family related. They ain't family related, we at the tent. Like, we got to. There's nothing that can stop our momentum. The only thing that's going to stop us is if we stop ourselves.
Right now, Amazon is on their high horse, and we want to punch them in the face.
We should just go in, occupy that training room, and don't even let them hold the meetings.
Can we talk outside? Hey, you know that's illegal, right? You're not supposed to be doing that.
This is the long haul, right? This is the marathon.
This is our shot to make things better.
2 minutes, I'm gonna be arrested. What?
Huge. You know, the eyes of the world are looking at you right now.
Oh, you ain't seen nothing yet. It's just getting started.
an event not to be missed. So please follow the Museum of Political Corruption on social media and be sure to subscribe to our newsletter to receive notifications of all of our programming. And I wish you all a wonderful but not too hot summer. Take good care, and we'll see you soon. Good night.